If you are curious in conversation, you listen actively, and I talk about Stephen Covey's active listening there. If you listen actively, you become more authentic in the way you engage with people. If you're more authentic in the way you engage in a conversation, that conversation becomes more vulnerable, and if the conversation is more vulnerable, you both become more curious.
Hi, I'm Tracy Lovejoy.
And I'm Shannon Lucas. We are the co-CEOs of Catalyst Constellations, which is dedicated to empowering Catalyst to create bold, powerful change in the world.
This is our podcast, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, where we speak with Catalyst executives about ways to successfully lead transformation in large organizations. Today, I am incredibly excited for us to welcome to Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, Andy Lopata. Andy, will you wave hello? Andy is a distinguished expert in professional relationships with over 25 years experience. Is that what we're going with now, Andy? 25?
Yes, yeah, I'm about 26 years now. So
you are a Hall of Fame speaker and author of 6 influential books, and you dive deep into the art of networking and mentoring, and we have learned already so much from you. Your newest book, The Financial Times Guide to Mentoring, a complete guide to effective mentoring, was out earlier this year and was runner-up as Leadership Book of the Year. Congratulations. What a wonderful thing to celebrate. You bring insights that have graced audiences globally, from Google to the BBC, amazing names to be affiliated with. And today we are so excited to have you bring your treasure trove of strategies to our Catalyst listeners, helping them network and become much more powerful in the relationships they build. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us, Andy.
thank you so much for inviting me on. I've been looking forward to this. And anyone listening rather than watching on the podcast, I apologize because you said wave hello, so I waved, which must have sounded really weird to anyone who's on audio only. So I'll make up for that now. Hello.
Since we get to watch you and we know that some folks tune in on video, it is easy to forget. So thank you for keeping us honest there, Andy. That's great. So I just got to name a couple of things that we know sit in your bio. And one thing we love to do is have Catalyst leaders be able to introduce themselves. And so we'd love to have you share with us a few career highlights that help us see your catalytic nature. And these can be moments you feel proud of where you were driving, or for many of us as Catalysts, they may be the moments that you got fired or kind of rage quit because things were at a point as a Catalyst that just couldn't take. Over to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was looking at this conversation coming up, I went back and I went to the definition of a catalyst again, and I went back to our podcast when you appeared on mine, and it's all about instigating or accelerating change. And I think that's been in my DNA from an early stage, which early in my career wasn't necessarily a good thing because I didn't quite know how to direct that energy. So when you talk about the moments when you quit or left a job in a rage, some of that would have happened because of my frustration and my inability, ironically, given what I do now, but my inability to build the right relationships to create the change that I saw the need for, or to earn the respect first to be able to make the observation. So my first 4 years in permanent roles post uni were in 2 civil service jobs. So the British Public Service, and just like the US, I'm sure is the same, it's very conservative with a small c. You know, it's an environment where people don't traditionally embrace change. And I stress traditionally because I've had a call this today with one of the departments I used to work with, and I was with a group of change makers. So I think that culture is shifting, certainly since all that time ago when I worked there. But, you know, you weren't necessarily warmly embraced if you were a catalyst straight out of university, particularly. And I had people in my team I was managing who'd been in their job longer than I'd been alive at that stage. So that immediately springs to mind. I think about when I came into the world of networking and professional relationships 26 years ago, and I recognized quite quickly that networking was a great buzzword, and it was starting back then to grow in popularity in the UK, but it wasn't really front of mind and it wasn't natural. I'd never heard of the word until my father started a business network. So whereas it might be embedded in US culture, in UK culture, it was less so. And particularly a quarter of a century ago, you know, post 2008 and post pandemic, it's much better understood. But what I recognized was that my father and his business partner had co-founded a business network. I came in to join them after 6 months. We were creating these meetings for local businesses. We were giving them an agenda and telling them what to do, but we weren't showing them how to do it. So I created training to show them how. But then I realized they didn't know why they were doing it in the first place. So then I created the training to show them why. And that was sort of the journey for me was one where when it came to training of networking, people always used to talk about networking skills. And I started talking about networking strategy. And interestingly, I Googled it at the time and I couldn't find anyone else anywhere talking about networking strategy. We're talking about 2007. I did subsequently find that 2 people I knew were talking about networking strategy, but they weren't active on social media. They weren't putting it, so they were doing it under the radar, so to speak. But generally, it wasn't being talked about. We talked about skills. We talked about, use Susan Rowan's phrase, how to work the room, but never why you're in the room in the first place. And then for me, you know, and I'm missing a number of catalytic points, if you like, but just as a summary of some of the things that spring to mind. The other thing for me on my journey, as someone who I guess would want to be defined as a thought leader, I never think that's a definition you can apply to yourself. It's something that other people have to apply to you, and I would hope they would. You can only be a thought leader if you're ahead of the crowd, and that requires catalytic moments. Where, you know, I started talking about networking strategy. You've probably heard that phrase countless times now. 2007, you wouldn't have done. So I had to move forward and reframe. I now talk about professional relationship strategy. I don't use the word networking anywhere near to the degree I did. It's very much a secondary or tertiary word for me now because of the perceptions it brings up for people. And by talking about professional relationship strategy, we're now saying you need to think more thoughtfully and purposefully about something you take for granted. And let's forget about this networking word and just focus on this that means more. So we're starting to see that be talked about more. And there are certain things that I've talked about and you see them enter more common conversation, more common dialogue. And I take that as a tick in the box that I've made a difference. And that's what I'm always aspiring to do. What's next? What can I do to move this forward? Because the second I rest on my laurels, and this will be the last catalytic moment I'll share in this answer, is I remember a number of years ago, I delivered a training session for a client in professional services. They were a lawyer or an accountant or a bank, something similar to that. And I delivered this material that I had developed that hadn't been out there before, that I knew was original at the time I developed it. And when the feedback came back, someone had said, it's all very well and good, but we've heard this before. We need new ideas. So you cannot rest on your laurels. You may pat yourself on the back and say, I've changed the conversation, or I've come up with new ideas. I've produced new models. But then if they're any good, other people start delivering that as well. And then you just become one amongst the pack. So for me, that's one of the biggest prompts to say, okay, what's next to drive this forward?
Ooh, that left me in an exhausted place. And I know, you know, I'll move us on, but now I get so curious of like, what does that take, Andy? And what does that look like to always, with the goal of others naming you a thought leader and knowing that there's kind of a short shelf life before your ideas are widely distributed. How does that show up in your everyday?
Well, first of all, there's a short shelf life if your ideas are widely distributed, so they've got to be good and they've got to be resonant. Otherwise, they won't be widely distributed. So but you won't be a thought leader because no one's following.
Fair enough.
So those are the things that go together. What does it show like every day? I'm not sitting there every day and saying, what's the new idea today? But what I am doing is I need to be active delivering content. And, the clients I work with are demanding and they expect the best and they pay well for the best. So I cannot rest on my laurels.
Yeah.
And I can't just say, oh, they want this talk, therefore I will deliver this. I insist on briefing calls and I ask about the audience and I ask about their expectations and we talk about how this will work and how that will work. And that's how I generate new ideas. I have a monthly blog for Psychology Today, and sometimes I'll interview people for it and I'll get exposed to new ideas through that. I have to think about what can I write about that people will want to read.
Yeah.
And writing for a publication like Psychology Today, where I have an editor who will tell me, no, this isn't good enough, really pushes me to say, is there value in this? Ruth Gotian, who my co-author with the Financial Times Guide to Mentoring, and we submit articles and we're published by Harvard Business Review. We really have to hit the mark with something fresh and new and innovative if we're going to be published there. I have my podcast where I'm talking to thought leaders and high achievers from around the world in all manner of fields. That's exposing me to new ideas. And give you an example of that. On my podcast, which you've both been on, the topic of curiosity kept coming up, even though I wasn't asking about it and I wasn't speaking about it. And I had one particular interview where this came to a head. So there were two interviews that stand out. One was with a lady called Daniela Landher, and Daniela is a former global talent manager or leader with Google. And Daniela came up with this wonderful quote that I've repeated so many times. Going to do it again now. It's in the book, and she said we have to move away from trying to be the smartest person in the room, the person who knows the most, to being the one who learns the most. So that was sort of probably the spark for me. And so I start repeating that everywhere. So that's probably part of the journey of developing new ideas. And then I had a guest, Richard Gerver, who had turned around a failing school in the UK, serially failing school, and really turned it around, became a top headmaster, and has brought those lessons into the corporate world. And talking to Richard, we started talking about this topic and we talked about curiosity, authenticity, listening and vulnerability. And I realized how they were all tied together. So straight after that podcast, I created what I call the curiosity cycle. And I wrote a blog about it for Psychology Today. So if you are curious in conversation, you listen actively. And I talk about Stephen Covey's active listening there. If you listen actively, you become more authentic in the way you engage with people. If you're more authentic in the way you engage in a conversation, that conversation becomes more vulnerable. And if the conversation is more vulnerable, you both become more curious. So you start the cycle again, and that cycle leads to deeper trust and greater engagement. So now that's part of my training. So that's a good example of how a model will develop for me. So it's not necessarily me sitting down and going, I need a new model, but it's the conversations I have, the deadlines I set, the ideas that I have to produce in written or audio form or whatever it might be, the talks that I give that constantly feed ideas. I have something when I deliver presentations, there's a QR code on each slide, and if people scan the QR code, they go to a free text poll where they can submit a question, and then what I will do is I'll answer those questions in a video for everyone who was at the presentation a week later, so it helps embed the learning and keep it fresh. I had one of those this week, and it was a really interesting question around, is it easier to build a relationship with someone who's from the same background as you, and what does that mean for building relationships with people with a different background? And I started answering it, but my immediate thought was, well, this is a blog for Psychology Today, because I can interview someone about this and I can go more deeply into it. I can answer it to a degree, but who's an expert in this? So then I'm deepening my knowledge. So those types of things that you need to be doing all the time. There's one thing I'll add to that, and that is I think the most robust content that I've ever had, which you would hope. You know, every year you want it to be more and more robust. But in 2019, I repositioned from networking to professional relationships. And shortly afterwards, I was delivering a one-day workshop for GlaxoSmithKline. And I didn't sleep well the night before. Not because I was nervous about the workshop. I think I wasn't looking forward to sitting on the M25 motorway around London in the rush hour the next day, because it's not a nice journey to be there for 9 o'clock or 8:30. But I woke up, if I slept at all, and 3 occasions had to get out of bed and write a new model on a post-it note. I just lay there and these ideas popped into my head, fully formed. They are still pretty much what I share today. And they form the basis of the work that I do. That one night, I got 3 ideas that turned into models that form the base of the work that I do now. And that was just my subconscious doing the work. So when you talk about day to day, all these conversations you have, all this development of ideas that you do, is feeding your subconscious. And then when you don't want to be thinking about it, it creates a space and it pops in.
So much, so many things to pick up on. Tracy actually just messaged me, which is like super clear distillation. She said, I love the provocation that to be a thought leader, you need to first be a thought listener and learner.
There you go. New idea. I should blog that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And the other thing, like I'm sitting there applying, I'm like, oh, all of those moments, there's an invitation there too, to set yourself up for the stretch opportunity, or like the public speaking opportunity, or like having some of those forcing functions in your life that actually makes your brain start to, instead of getting out, we talk about like being in the river of the normal work versus standing on the banks and like having the perspective. And so I'm going to have to challenge myself with, I need to get some of those things to force some of that dot connecting thinking. You mentioned, as you were sharing that, something that's like powerful, true, and yet challenging, which is how much easier it is for us to develop relationships with people like us. And that's so true for Catalyst, because they move at our speed. I was so tired yesterday. I'll share this personal story. I was so tired yesterday. And my very last call was with a new woman that I didn't know. And I was almost like, do I cancel the meeting? And she's a ultra catalyst. And I was buzzing by the end of the meeting. It was like a recharge, like the paddles have been put on, right? That's what it feels like for Catalyst to talk. But we have to live in the real world where we're surrounded by not catalysts. And so I'm wondering, as like a catalyst and a relationship expert, how we bridge that divide to show up in the ways that you're talking about with people who might not think like us.
It's a great question. And it goes back to one of the early things that I said about my early career, where you use the term catalyst. I probably more frequently use the term about myself as an opinionated sod. Where I'm not the player of politics, and certainly when I worked for big organizations in my 20s, I wasn't good at the political game. Where I work with people now who are in that position, it's about developing the relationships with the right people. And the mistake that I made was that I wasn't thinking about the other person's perspective. I wasn't thinking about how that was landing, or how they process that information, or whether they would support me, how they buy into it, how it would impact them, any of those things. I was just like, we should do this. So you talk about the energy and the buzz of talking to a catalyst, and that resonates strongly with me. I get the same. I'm exhausted, but then I get into that conversation and I forget how I feel. I've been stressed at work today, but then I get into a conversation and I'm energized again. But not everyone is like that with you. But if you've developed the relationship where they trust you and respect you and want to hear what you have to say, if you enter into conversations from that curiosity mindset, rather than, the classic phrase I've used for years is engage, not broadcast. And what an enthusiastic young catalyst, and I never would have used that phrase for myself, but if the cap fits, I guess that is the mindset that I would have brought to things. That young person back then, I wasn't trying to understand why things were how they were. I was just arguing that they shouldn't be. And I would just end up in arguments with my colleagues because I hadn't taken the time to try and work out why they were, to, what led to the situation over many years that people had been working with and comfortable with. The arrogance of assuming that, hey, I've got a fresh pair of eyes and I'm seeing this differently. And in the public sector where, these conversations have probably happened multiple times before I've even been born. So that curiosity mindset is really key. You of course can also get into personality types and recognizing personality types. So not coming in full throttle if you're in conversation with an introvert, as a simple example, recognizing when people need space to reflect and not just jump into the conversation, giving people that space, giving people that respect. And I don't think I was able to do that at that time in my career. I would hope.
How do you do that now? Because the way of being a catalyst is like, it's our natural default position, and everything that you're saying is true, but there's like, we have to develop this capacity to do that thing that you're talking about. How did you learn to do that?
It's not for me to say that I know that I do it now. And that's, I was going to come on to that, because the answer is I'm not sure where it comes up for me in the same way, because I went into business with my father. This particular business we co-founded together in 2007. My father is sadly no longer with us.
Right.
But we used to clash heads, particularly in the early days. Very different personality types. Again, he'd been in business naturally for a lot longer than I had. And I came in with all my ideas and so forth and didn't respect his experience. Now, over a period of time, he came to respect more and more the opinions I brought to the table. But that took a while. I had to earn it. But since he was always in the business until the last days, but less and less so. And my mother is still working with me, and I have other people around us in the business. But it's more my show now to a degree in terms of direction and where we go. So I'm not in that position of having to persuade people in the same way. I will still have conversations, but I'm in the driving seat now. So it doesn't show up for me in the same way. The reason I'm not sure how much I've learned is when I have been in a board position on professional associations, some of the old challenges still come out, because I don't stop to think when I'm in that space. And I just come through with my enthusiasm for the new idea. And I found myself on a very small c conservative board. So being British, we always say small c conservative because you've got large c conservative in government as well.
Thanks for the clarification for the audience. Totally. Thank you.
But people who were risk averse, comfortable in the status quo. And I would always challenge that. And I'm not sure that I did navigate it the way I would want to. So even now, I'm not sure that I am brilliant at that. And it's a bit of the cobbler's shoes. Does that term resonate for you?
Totally.
Yeah. So when you're in the moment and you're enthusiastic and you feel passionately about something, it's very hard to take your own medicine in my case, and to sit back and say, am I curious? Am I listening? Am I seeking to understand? And I would look at how I was the last time I was on that board, the one I've got in mind, and say, maybe I could have handled things a different way.
Thank you for the super authentic, truthful answer, because I think it's like we can sit here and wax philosophical on podcasts, but the reality is it's hard. I mean, that's it, and we're imperfect in having self-compassion. You did bring up a nuance, though, that I want to follow up on, which is when you're the decider, when you're sitting in the captain's chair, when you're like, I don't have to bring those people along yet. But yet we know, particularly catalyst leaders in large organizations, even if we can set the direction, if we're not doing all the things, the curiosity, the authenticity, the listening, and the vulnerability, we're going to leave our team behind. And so I'm just wondering if you have, for the Catalyst execs, who is mostly our audience, if you have advice for that relationship building, bringing your team along, your org along.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm coming back into that position now because we're in the process of launching a new business where I've already got the team in place. So it isn't just me. And it's not just me now in the main business, but there is more of there are more opinions around the table, let's put it that way. That hasn't come up as a challenge yet, but it's a good reminder to me to refocus on that. I have a talk called Vulnerable Leadership. And one of the key phrases I use in that talk, and in fact, it's the one I close on, is that we have to know when we lead not from above, but from among. And we have this cultural perspective or image of leadership as being the person with all the answers, pointing the way and saying, this is what we'll do. Whereas for me, a great leader isn't someone who knows all the answers, but surrounds themselves with people who can provide them and curates them and decides as the ultimate decider on the way forward. So my advice to Catalyst execs is, you, particularly if you are a Catalyst exec and you are a change maker, a thought leader in this space or in your space, is you may be innovative, you may be creative with your ideas, you may have cutting edge ideas. That doesn't make you the only one. So are you surrounding
Oh,
yourselves with people who can challenge those ideas? Are you surrounding yourselves with people who can test those ideas? Because if you surround yourselves with yes men and women, then you could be setting yourself up for a fall. So find people like you, but also find people who might not necessarily be innovators, but are brilliant processors, analysts, and use them. Give them space and have the humility, which at times in my career I will have lacked without a doubt. Have the humility to say, I think this is a great idea, but I don't know it is. Help me decide, and be open to allow other people to adapt it or even dismiss it.
You just left me with a really great self-reflection question that I need to practice, which is, when is the last when is the last time someone challenged me or challenged one of my ideas? Because if the answer is I don't remember, then I'm probably not being open in the way that you're talking about. So I think, thank you for that.
And I would add to that, or my question for you, I guess, and it can be rhetorical if you want, for people in a similar space, is, do you have a mentor? Do you have a mastermind group, a group of peers that will challenge you? So if the answer is, I cannot remember the last time someone challenged me on my ideas, or even it's not happening regularly, it's probably because you haven't got a formalized system for accountability, reflection, and feedback. Whether that's a mentor, whether that's a mastermind group, whatever it might be, create that environment. A coach is another example, someone who can do that. Create that space for people to push back.
I love that. You're a master at models. I love how everything you say ends up synthesizing into a Psychology Today article model. Amazing. Okay. So, Catalyst audience, you've walked the walk as a catalyst yourself. If I forced you into a corner to boil it down, what are like our three biggest communication mistakes, Andy? And how do we avoid them?
Well, the first one I've mentioned, and that would be, we broadcast rather than engage. So the way you avoid that is ask questions, be curious. Don't present the fait accompli, but throw it out there. Here's an idea. What do you think? Or even before you bring your idea to the table, share the problem and say, how would you approach this? Engage people in the conversation. And I think that's probably the first challenge in this sense by a country mile. The second, and it's related to that, is, and again, I'm thinking of myself and my history on this, is the ability to shut up and listen. So, as soon as I'm a fixer by nature, I think these things go hand in hand. So if you tell me you've you're struggling with something at work. I'm like, how can I help you? What can I do? Not everyone wants that. And sometimes as soon as a challenge is mentioned, the temptation is there to come in with a solution. You can't have fully formed it. But the key point here is that people might not be looking for a solution at that point. Now, move this into personal life. Your partner or a close friend tells you that they're struggling at work, or they've had a really rotten day. I've had it on WhatsApp over the last 24 hours with a good friend of mine I was supposed to be out with tomorrow night. And she's having an awful time, to the point she's taken a sick day today because she can't cope with what's going on. I haven't asked her what's going on there, and she actually can't tell me because it's confidential because of the nature of where she's working. But that's not what she'll be looking for. I've just promised her a hug when I see her next week. And sometimes people just want that. They just want to tell you they're having a bad time. They don't want you to do anything about it, and they don't expect you to. If you're a fixer, and I'm thinking a lot of catalysts will be fixers, that's anathema to us. We don't understand that. So I think the second is to shut up and listen, and try to just be there and just try to understand before jumping into that fixing slot. And then I'm thinking a little bit on my feet here. So the third one, so we have broadcast, don't engage, engage, don't broadcast, or mistake is we broadcast, don't engage, shut up and listen. And then, yeah, I think the third in terms of communication is to create the space. So these are all tied to each other very closely, but I touched on something really important, and that is the power of introverts and the untapped power of introverts. And I think that if you're a catalyst executive and you are forceful when you have ideas, the chances are, unless you're conscious about it, you are not allowing the space for the quieter people on your team to contribute to the process. And not if, say, you have a meeting to find a resolution to a challenge or a next step forward, you're hoping to come away with your answers in that meeting. I had a meeting this morning about moving a project forward. I was hoping to come out with responses. I could see very early that we weren't. And what I suggested at the end was that we create the potential solution as a document, put it into a project planning system for people to contribute over a 6 to 8 week period. Then we move forward. What that does is it enables everyone to contribute, whether they are a fixer who immediately comes up with ideas, or whether they're a reflector who needs to go away, sit on it, play with it, and then come up with their thoughts. And trying to solve everything in a 1 hour Teams meeting was a fool's errand.
You've I'm going to tag this podcast as something that I need to listen to over and over again. It's such a good reminder. And it's like, actually, Andy, you're making me do the reflection that we were talking about earlier. So there's something also just super meta about this conversation. So thank you. All right. As we move to wrap up, I'm super curious about your answer to this. Who's your favorite famous or favorite inspirational catalyst, past or present, and why?
I always struggle with this type of question. I'm not one for idol worship or role models, which is ironic because I think role models play a key part in our success, but I don't necessarily pick people out. So I have authors that I like, and there are stories that resonate with me, but I always struggle to name someone. If I was to give the cliched answer, Steve Jobs is a great example of an innovator, a catalyst. And the reason I would probably mention Steve Jobs is that he was focused on the impact on the end user, which is one of the most important things we need to do. And he's famous for really focusing on the user experience. But I can't say, I mean, I've read biographies of Steve Jobs, but I can't say I'm a fanboy in the sense that I could tell you everything he did. It's not my way of operating. And actually, some of the people that influence me are just the people that I deal with day to day, whether they're my clients, they're people on my training courses, and they might just say something that really resonates with me. Fellow speakers and trainers and authors have a big influence on me as well. You know, we've mentioned Ruth Gautier, and since I've met Ruth, she's a constant source of inspiration as well. But there's no one that I always struggle. However this question is formed, I always struggle with it because I do not have, you know, when I was a kid, I had Kim Wilde and Toya and Susie Sue on my wall and Annie Lennox. I don't have the same in business. I don't have those posters up on my wall in business. So I always struggle with that, but hopefully that gives. So and it's sometimes it's the individual conversation and the person out of the spotlight, and they make the difference to me.
That doesn't surprise me, given the work that you do and everything that you said. It's like the being present with who's in front of you and what the inspiration is at each touch point. So thank you so much. You have been insanely inspirational to me today, as you can tell. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and all of your models with our audience.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It's such an interesting angle for me, and I love doing podcast interviews where it's not the same questions, and it gets me to think in a different way. And so, thank you for that.
Absolutely. And to our listening audience, thanks so much for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about how to create bold, powerful change in the world, be sure to check out our book, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, or go to our website at catalystconstellations.com.
And because we know you loved this podcast like we did, Shannon and I both reeling with ways we need to go get better in our relationship management and finding our mentors, take a few seconds to rate it on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you're listening. And please share this very important conversation with all the other catalysts in your life. Andy, thank you again.